Well, today we want to talk a little bit about raising our standards. We alluded to that in the opening. And I decided to talk about that this week because I got a comment recently on our BossBetter YouTube channel. And I'm not going to share the name of the person who shared it because she didn't volunteer to be on a podcast. But she left a long comment underneath one of the videos we have there about how bosses demoralize teams, where she described working at a clinic with two doctors who were consistently treating their people really poorly. She said that they would constantly yell and curse and demoralize people. She said anytime we would hire a good person, they would leave quickly. They were disrespectful to patients. Whenever there was any kind of problem or hiccup or issue, these doctors would just yell, just fix it, and never really accept that maybe some things couldn't be fixed. They never got thanks. They never got raises. Just a pretty lousy place to work. And she asked me, what should I do? And she said, I've been here 8 years and I'm 51 years old and I don't know what to do. And I am loath to tell people what to do, to give people advice about their professional circumstances. I learned a long time ago, the best thing that I can do is to answer by talking about what I might do in that situation. And so what I shared with her is that this isn't something she can fix, that nothing is going to change there, and that in all likelihood, the only thing ahead of her is more continued suffering. And so I said, if this was me, I would polish my resume and start looking for my next opportunity. And I would feel confident that I would end up being happier. This is a conversation I've had a lot when it comes to people who are suffering at the hands of a bad boss. And for one reason or another, leaving a bad boss or leaving a job where you're not being treated well, for some folks, it's a huge hill to climb. And, some of that is about income and stability and fear, but there are a lot of folks who feel trapped, and they are trapped in what is really an abusive relationship. And I wonder what it will take for some folks to eventually decide, I am worthy of more than this, and I need to take the scary step to leave or to move on. And I know that some of this ties into your own story and experiences, Alyssa. And so I thought this might be an interesting thing for us to talk about today. And let me say one other thing about this before I hand the reins over to you. Raising those standards around working for a bad boss goes the other way too, because I have the exact same conversation with folks who tell me, I've got this awful employee who treats everybody like crap, but they won't pull the trigger on getting rid of him or her. And so there's things change when we set boundaries for how we are going to allow others to treat us, and for how we are going to allow others to treat others. How do folks raise those standards and pull the trigger on some things that might be hard but clearly necessary?
That's what I want to do, is just go, I so identify with that. And I think what's behind that noise is really a lot of, for my own self, what I'll name as shame and guilt for not being strong enough, not being whatever enough to leave. And I, to this day, I don't think I left. I think that I was only allowed myself out because I couldn't do to myself. I couldn't do to my son, my child, what I had done to myself in that, what that job did to me. And so when it became about somebody else, then it became worth it for me to leave. And there's a lot of what the heck is wrong with you? That goes in my brain and has continually, tried to tackle the beast that is hindsight, and wondering why I spent all those years feeling that way when it was just a stinking job.
Right.
And when somebody shows you who they are, listen,
Yeah.
right? And I just kept not listening. I didn't listen to them and I didn't listen to me. And that is my biggest regret, is that I didn't listen to me. My body told me, my brain told me, all of the, I mean, my husband told me 1,000 different times, leave. This is not good for you.
Yeah.
I, I don't have the answer to what it takes to leave, because for me, it took another human,
Mm.
because I knew that I could not be the mom that I wanted to be and still have that job. And so it took somebody else to make it real for me. And I'm not sure. I think that that's where the work of what I do with values has really gained a lot of clarity in my mind and in my heart, about why I will never allow that to happen to me. And again, it's not just, uh, the sacrifices and the abuses that you take in life aren't just obviously, and, from this one person, that kind of thing. But I will never replicate or even delve a little bit into the shallow end of
Mm-hmm.
losing myself again and being in conflict with my values and who I am. And so, the only heartening thing that I can take away from that is that because of that circumstance, I am now stronger. I now know who I am deeply and earnestly, and I will never allow that to happen to myself again, for me and only me.
I think the analogy of an abusive relationship is appropriate, and maybe it's not an analogy, it's a parallel. And
Mhm.
I'm not an expert in those circumstances by any means, and so I'm not going to pretend to be one. I'm not going to play one on a podcast. Um, I'm sure there are parallels between the cycles and the ups and downs that people go through, and all the things that have to happen in someone's psyche before they decide that I need to make a change. I'm a big fan of an old saying in psychology that change only occurs when the pain of staying the same finally outweighs the pain of the change. And so I think
Mm.
there's a long time where maybe you work for a difficult boss or in a difficult circumstance, or you've got a really difficult employee, and what it would take to move away from that is more painful in some folks' mind than just continuing to endure it and work around it and try to survive it. Um, and only when folks decide I can't take this anymore, it is now the pain of the change going to be less than the pain I'm enduring. I should also acknowledge that there's a certain amount of privilege that I have in terms of sitting here saying, well, just get another job. Right, that's a really easy thing for me to lob out there into the world, and I know that is not always possible. I know that's not always an option for some folks for a variety of reasons, and so let me speak that plainly, because that's an important thing to say. But I also think that, sorry, not non sequitur. This second expression is not tied to the one I just made, but
And
yeah, and I do think that there are different levels of tolerance for some of that suffering, though. I'm reminded of a story that I picked up when I was interviewing folks for my first book, and this was shared by a manager. Interestingly enough, also a clinical manager in a healthcare setting. In the book, we named her Juanita. That wasn't her real name. We changed her name, as we do with all the names in the books, to protect the innocent and the awful. And Juanita told me a story about stepping into a manager role. She had been in a manager role previously in some other sites, but they added a site for her to take over, and she started working in this site. And the one of the physicians there was known to be very difficult. And one day, very early on in her career, she handed him a folder. This was back when they had paper medical records. And he took it from her, and as he looked at it, he immediately threw it right back at her, and it smacked her in the face. And apparently, she had used the little paper clips when his preference was for the jumbo paper clips. And he yelled at her for this. And she said, what happened next wasn't a conscious choice. It wasn't thoughtful. It just erupted out of me. She said, as soon as that folder hit me in the face and he was yelling, I threw it right back at him, and it smacked him in the face. And I said, who the F do you think you are? That will never happen again, she said, and I walked away. She said, and nobody else in the place could believe that I had done that to him. She said, but he spoke to me differently every day after that, and it never did happen again with me. And so again, this idea that the boundaries that we set for how we allow people to talk to us and how we allow others to talk to others, at times they have to be set and installed and enforced by us individually. And if we're leaders in an environment, we have to enforce those in an environment if we're going to protect our people. And isn't that our number one job, is to keep people safe? But it's that boundary setting that I think can be really difficult sometimes.
I think that is a great illustration of the cycle of what I experienced, not obviously with that specific scenario by any means, but the thought pattern around setting boundaries, right? And so sometimes you're not able to set boundaries for other people. You can set them for yourself, right? And in that situation, she was able to set a boundary both ways, because it clearly he knew he could no longer do that with her, right? What I think I got caught up in too often in the cycle of setting boundaries, because there was many a cycle I put myself through of setting those boundaries for myself, was that when I attempted to set boundaries for that other person, for that leader, no one else, it felt like, and it would set boundaries. And so then it was just my problem and not an actual, and I'm using air quotes, an actual problem, because it was my inability. It was my inability to manage that behavior, the behavior of demeaning and gaslighting and demoralizing and just utter nonsense. Mm-hmm. And I stayed because I wanted to keep other people safe. I thought I could. The longer I was there, the more I was able to be the filter. We've talked about the role of being the filter, being the buffer, right, as the leader. And I took that seriously. I wanted to try to protect and insulate my teams from those kinds of behaviors. But it sucked the life out of me, quite literally.
And you know what, Alyssa, that is something that I hear from a lot of leaders too, is if I leave, there's nobody there to protect my people. I'm the only thing standing between them and this, awful force of nature. And I get that. And it's noble to a point. The reality is losing good people is a consequence of the bad behavior. And sometimes the bad behavior will never end until you leave and then the other people leave. And of course, sometimes the bad behavior will never end. Some people are just going to keep showing up that way and just keep treating people poorly. But that doesn't mean that you have to stay and suffer just because you're fearful that other people will suffer. You eventually will become so worn down or so psychologically beat up by it that now you're no good for the folks you're trying to protect. And
Yeah.
Your story sort of proves the hypothesis, though, right? That only when we set those boundaries for ourselves and we do not accept that we are going to be treated a certain way, even if it means leaving, only then does our life get better. Do our circumstances get better? I'm thinking about a book. Are you familiar with Robert Sutton's book, The No Asshole Rule?
No, but I like the title already.
Yeah, it was a bestseller a couple of years ago, one of the real big business books here, maybe about 10 years ago. And he writes about this, and it's not a tongue-in-cheek kind of way. He actually uses asshole as a technical term. My apologies for anyone listening who doesn't appreciate the colorful language. I am quoting a book title, but he says, you have an asshole on your team, and he talks about assholes cannot be overcome. They do too much harm. They cannot stay. You have an asshole on your team when two things are happening. One, do others feel worse after interacting with this person? And two, does this person target the less powerful? I'm a small business owner. There is no amount of money that is worth having somebody like that on my team. You couldn't pay me to have somebody on my team. They do too much harm. They sabotage. They spread suffering wherever they go. And it is not, if I have that person on my team, it is not my job to fix them. It's my job to get people away from them. It's my job to keep my team safe and to try to get them out of there. And if that can't happen, then the only option I have left is to go to a safer place, and that might be a different job.
Yeah. I appreciate so much the conversation around boundaries and being able to raise those standards. I often in sessions with clients have the opportunity to help them draw up some boundaries for themselves. And I'm not sure exactly of the context in which this first came to me, but I once remarked that boundaries are the ultimate expression of self-compassion. And so I know it's tough to set boundaries. I've lived it. I've breathed it. It almost killed me, folks. I mean, I couldn't walk for 3 months. So I deeply feel and understand those depths of being unaligned and crippled in your values by other people in the workplace. But take heart, take stock of yourself, and make some boundaries because you deserve it.
It's a great point to end on. And I want to acknowledge the folks out there for whom maybe they're wrestling with this right now, and they are in a circumstance, whether with an abrasive boss or an abrasive member of their team, where it feels impossible to escape. And we want to tell you that it's not. Sometimes it takes a leap of faith. Sometimes it takes a big, scary decision. And sometimes it's just important to acknowledge that you probably didn't get here because some single thing happened, right? We all have boundaries, and it's easier in some ways for if a violation is going to occur, for it to be a big, giant, obvious violation. It would almost be easier for somebody to act out in a so obviously inappropriate way that we have no choice but to say, whoa, that is not okay. That's never happening again. But I think for most of the folks listening, it's death by 1,000 cuts. The encroachment on those boundaries is minuscule. It's just a little bit over the line, and then it's a little bit over the line, and ooh, I didn't like that, and that was uncomfortable, and I don't like the way that person talked to me, but oh, they were having a bad day, and we dismiss it, and then all of a sudden, there's been a shift in what is okay. And so if you are in such a circumstance, whether it was a big giant violation or has been a bunch of little things over and over again, you are worthy of being treated with dignity and respect wherever you work and by everyone who comes into contact with you.